Welcome to this week's edition of On Point. Our guest is Michael Brown, the Minister of Education, Science and Technology. We're anxious to find out from him what he's done so far in the year and a half he's been the Minister. Welcome, Minister.
Thank you, Julian. Thanks for having me.
Now, you've assumed responsibility for what could be regarded as one of the most significant sectors of the country's activity, education. It is an area that really gets a sizable budget every year in many countries around the world. I want to start by getting a sense of your vision as the education minister in particular.
Well, I think, Julian, one of the most critical things is that education, when we look at education in the Caribbean, specifically education in Antigua and Barbuda, is how do we adapt our education system to be more responsive to the needs of a shifting global economy, global market. For instance, there are societies that have changed from being an agrarian society to an industrial society. We are faced in that we have to look forward to the advance of technology. We have to look for the change of jobs, change of industries. How does that impact our education system? So fundamentally, coming into an education system as it is now, as it has existed for quite a number of years, how do we create a system that is more robust, a curriculum that is more engaging to the real needs of our society? And how do we best position the stakeholders, the staff, the teachers, pedagogues all together to be in a position to capitalize on teaching practices, the developmental practices, to be able to engage learners as they are. Education overall, and this is not just in Antigua, education in a global sense, faces a very real challenge. Information can be got off the internet, Google, smartphones in a very quick pace of time. How do we create an education system so that we can engage our students with very real-time information in a very real way? Our approach is that we have to look at several different entities. The key to maintaining a good school environment or good educative environment, one, we have to make sure the physical facilities are intact so that learning can take place. What we have been doing, the ministry has been doing since we had taken office, we have restructured the budget. We have started to cut and trim in various areas to the Board of Education so that we can provide maintenance in our schools, physical maintenance of the infrastructures. On taking office, many of the conditions that existed in most of our schools have been the same for years. You're talking about buildings that have just gone with no repair and no paint. One of the first things we did was to make sure we gave a facelift. The most, I think the example that jumped out at most people was the T.N. Kernan School, when that had a facelift. We continue that exercise year round. So for the last year and a half or so, at least since we've been in office, we have had a continuous process of upgrading the physical facilities in our schools. What we've also done as well, you also have to look at to make sure the environment is safe. And that's a second component to creating a conducive environment. So how do we do this? We're strengthening our relationship with the police. There's a youth task force now that we have developed a closer relationship with. We have begun to renegotiate the terms to which we engage the private security firms as they maintain the environment of our schools. Now, currently, the responsibility for school security lies solely with the Ministry of Public Works. We're in the process now of arresting that budget and personnel and so forth to bring it to the Ministry of Education so we have a closer hand in how schools are secured, at least the physical environments of the schools are secured. The other thing is we look towards the upgrade of staff. And the government and the ministry, and I must say I feel extremely proud of this undertaking. We have undertaken the task to upgrade the entire teaching service. So within a 5-year to 7-year projection, we're looking at every single teacher that would have been in the system now would be upgraded to a minimum of a bachelor's degree in education or an education-related field. It is true, Julian, that we have quite a number of applications for persons wanting to get into teaching. The fact is, the requisite qualifications that we're looking for to match the shortage niche areas is where we have a serious shortage. So for instance, we'll have, let's say, 60 applications with business administration degrees, associate degrees. But at the same time, we have a shortage of primarily foreign language teachers, so French, Spanish, We have a shortage of geography teachers, but we can't get the requisite qualifications in those areas. So we are readjusting to be able to do that. The fourth component, or the fourth pillar, is being able to ensure that tertiary education is put in place and is structured in such a way so that anybody in Antigua and Barbuda who wants to have access to any form of educational upgrade or additional training, they will be able to do that. So Julian, we have touched on 4 areas. We've touched on the physical environment. We've also touched on the physical security of our educational campuses. We've touched on the upgrade of the staff, and we have touched on moving towards tertiary education. Not only upgrading in education as it is now, but when we look towards educating the youths who are coming out of school right now, we also have to look to upgrade educationally and training-wise the generations who are already in either the private sector or the public sector who are already working. So when you look towards the four-point prong of how we continue to develop education, now there's one fifth element, and the fifth element is where we do a continuous review of the other 4 processes. And then we figure out how do we continuously improve? How do we look at the information that's there? How do we use data to drive decision making? How do we use data to drive the reformation of education in Antigua and Barbuda? How do we use data not just to move from where we are now, but to get it into so we're able to compete educationally with many of the OECD countries who are already leaping ahead in leaps and bounds in introducing coding, for instance, in their lessons and in their classrooms? How best do we arrive at that level?
You made a comment on Teacher Appreciation Day as regards this whole matter of teachers qualifying with first degrees, etc. It did ruffle a few feathers.
Say it again. When you say teachers qualifying, what you mean?
You talk about teachers having a first degree.
Yeah.
All right. A little uncertainty because people not quite understand what the mechanics would be. Bearing in mind that if you take people out of the system for training, that there is going to be a shortfall that is already bad.
Yeah.
You do have a shortage of teachers, which you admitted.
Well, you see, we have a shortage of...
Yes. You said a 7-year cycle.
Yeah.
Is that realistic?
It's realistic because when we look to the university, the formation of the University of Antigua coming. I give you an example. As of January 2016, we will have the School of Education and the School of Nursing occupying the Five Islands campus. Now, the School of Education has about between 85 and 88 students. Once we would have given that increased space, strengthened the capacity of the staff, hire additional faculty, the School of Education will be positioned in about a year or so to accommodate at least between 200 and 300 students between full-time and part-time programs. Now, because it falls under the Ministry of Education, it always creates like a balanced expense neutrality range because it's a Ministry of Education facility. What it does as well, it gives teachers who do not have at least a first degree, because we're talking about building capacity of our most valuable resources. So teachers who do not have at least a first degree, they have the opportunity through open campus, because we're already paying, for instance, I'm facing a $10 million bill from the University of the West Indies, most of it primarily for economic cost. We're already paying the University of the West Indies through economic costs. And the fact is, we are really not utilizing the number of spaces that we ought to be able to utilize. So through Open Campus, not only can we upgrade our teachers, we can upgrade our nurses, we can upgrade persons to the private sector through full-time and part-time courses. Now, we have set the ambitious range of a 7-year, a 5 to 7 year cycle. It is very realistic because most of the classes can be done right here in Antigua. There are some relationships that we're working out, for instance, with Illinois Institute of Technology, where the aim is that they will have 2+2. Persons can do their training here, primarily when it comes to math, the sciences, which is an area that we really need to build as a nation, the sciences. So you're able to do the 2+2 in Antigua, and then you'll be able to go to Chicago for the 2 summers, and you'll be able to pick up additional 2 sets of summer school. You have summer school 1, summer school 2. So somebody is able to do anywhere from between 30 to 38 credits over the summer, and they can continue the rest right here to the University of Antigua and Barbuda. What it does overall is all the research demonstrates that the most key element that contributes to a child's overall cognitive development has a lot to do with the teacher's ability, the teacher's cognitive ability and their level of intelligence, and being able to capitalize on teachable moments. Now, we already have teachers with a lot of passion. Now, if we're able to give them the additional training to translate that passion even more, so they can talk to students so they're able to communicate better with students at the various levels. You have the higher order thinking students, you have the students, the majority that fall in the middle, and then you have all students that fall below average in terms of academic performance. We're able to connect with them on multiple levels, then that would be beneficial.
You're watching On Point with Julian Rogers, still to come.
The Teachers Union. You started off not having a great relationship with that body. What went wrong?
Well, I think I think for me, I take a lot of responsibility.
You're watching On Point with Julian Rogers.
I want to stay then with the teachers for one more focus, which has to do not just with the shortage physically, but with the shortage in terms of competence in teaching math and English. Because obviously that is the center of a major concern about how our children are being taught right now. What is the work of the ministry in this area?
Well, I think we talk about the work, we have to go back about a year ago when we came into office. One of the things that our government asked for was that we wanted to see a significant jump in mathematics. When we took office, the performance in, I think the CSEC performance in mathematics was about 32-34%. This year, for the first time in decades, our performance in terms of CSEC mathematics is above 50%. We took certain strategic decisions. One, the first decision was to bring back Dr. Karen Weston, because we sat down, we had a conversation, and she canvassed certain things that were pertinent and that she wanted to do in the schools. She was up for retirement. So there were quite a number of persons that I opted not to bring them back. But Dr. Karen Weston sufficiently persuaded me, and I was sold. So brought her back. I gave an additional 2 years to come back and to do exactly what she has done, to be able to bring us to that point. So strengthen our capacity. We have not only focused on the highest level in terms of our national or education officer of mathematics, but have also given her the resources and the power to be able to travel to Barbuda as frequently as you need to. And I'm extremely proud of the work that she and the teachers and the principals have done. In Barbuda, for instance, for the last 5 years before this year, we haven't had a pass in mathematics. Now in Barbuda, that's the last CSEC results, we had a 60% pass in mathematics. It shows that the policies that were put in place, the work that Dr. Karen Weston and the principal and the teachers have done in Barbuda tremendously paid off. Now I use the Barbuda as an example, but it's not the only example of public schools that have jumped significantly in being able to do that. Other things that we've also focused on as well is making sure that we have continuous and additional training for teachers. Getting teachers to understand the sense that in the classroom, the power is yours to be able to direct pedagogy, to be able to direct things as they ought to be able to do. Now, what we have done is sort of threefold, in addition to what I've mentioned so far. One, we are negotiating with Illinois Institute of Technology so we can get additional training for our math and our science teachers to bring them to that minimum of a bachelor's degree. And the focus not really so much is on the letter of the degree. It's merely on the competence that the instruction comes with. The other thing we've also done as well, we're looking, because we have a serious shortage of, we fell in English somewhat in some of our schools, so we want to be able to bring that in, but we want to focus on an interdisciplinary stream. And what that means, Julian, is simply there are many students that they can do math, they can do geography, they can do science, but they can't connect them. So how do we give our teachers that additional training to be able to connect the subjects across the areas? And that is something that we continue to build our capacity on. And so we continue to negotiate with several universities to be able to bring the training right here in Antigua for the teachers, including special education and being able to connect with our students, not just through evaluation, but evaluation, assessment, monitoring, and providing that additional support that students need to bring them to the point of performance.
The Teachers Union. You started off not having a great relationship with that body. What went wrong?
Well, I think I think for me, I take a lot of responsibility of drawing certain assumptions. I think one of the shortfalls, and when I had the conversation with the last meeting we had with the unions, I apologized. I said, listen, there were many things which, which came from the ministry in a way that it ought not to have come. But now that I have taken steps to do whatever corrections I needed to take within the ministry, to make sure that when information is when a policy directive is given, it's not merely that you go out and you say we're going to do this, but as technicians, you have to sit down with all the stakeholders.
So you're saying, in essence, admitting that there was not proper consultation?
Yeah. You have to sit down with all the stakeholders, and you have to ask, what's the best way we're able to get this done? And I think once I was able to handle that aspect of it from the ministry's perspective, because the fact is, Julian, if something goes wrong in the ministry, the box stands with me, and I'm responsible.
You got the blame?
Yeah, I got the blame, and rightfully so, because my job first was to go in, make sure that we address certain things in the ministry, especially when it comes to be able to communicate it with the outside. And so that I strongly believe was remedied, and we're at the position now where, I don't just send out a directive, and make sure I consult with the unions, consult with the parent associations, consult with various stakeholders, and then let's hear the feedback of what they have, of what persons have to say. So I think moving forward now, we're at that position where the ministry understands that we work as a team. And when I say as a team, it's the Ministry of Education, Science and Technology with all the stakeholders, especially the parents, especially the schools, especially the communities, because we have to be able to go out there and draw that broader connection. So and being able to do that, it literally means when we had a scare at one of our secondary schools, the thing was not for us to sit back and wait and watch and see, but what we did instead, the director and I, we went directly to the school. We spoke to the staff, we spoke to the students, we brought in the chief medical officer, and then afterwards we had 2 community meetings, 2 town hall meetings with the community, so we could have that direct dialogue with them. Primarily because it's only through continuous dialogue that we can reach at a single consensus. If information is not properly filtered to persons, then it creates some sort of confusion. So we've been able to iron out that, and as you can see going forward, I anticipate that we'll continue to have that amicable type of relationship. There have been some frustrations, which I'm quite passionate about because I'm a former teacher. There was a delay in getting the upgrades for teachers. This is something we came into office, we met successfully, I think it was last week or week before the last. We had 167 teachers that were upgraded to their rightful positions. We were behind on hiring teachers. We've always had a shortage in the system. And that's because in education, we have never made accommodation. For instance, if a teacher goes on maternity leave, there's never been accommodation to have a replacement teacher to fill that spot. So we're literally putting those provisions in place now so we can have additional teachers. But when you look overall at the system, for instance, in primary schools, in the private sector, for every 1 teacher, there are 11 students. It doesn't translate like that to every classroom. In the public system, for every 1 teacher, there are 14 students. But like I said, Julian, when you look at it, most persons want to be concentrated in schools in St. John's. Not only persons who live around those schools, but because you work in St. John's, you want your child to go to school in St. John's. But when you look overall at the system, the restructuring process that we're doing now to create a greater balance and equity, the transfer of teachers, for instance, that created quite a bit of a buzz, for instance, in the media. Much of it was much to do about nothing. I had asked the ministry to do a simple request. I had a simple request of the ministry. I want to make sure that we have the most qualified teachers with the students that need them the most. Move persons who you need to move and make sure that you align teachers' credentials, qualifications, and performance with the students that are most in need of them. So in terms of the transfers of teachers and so forth, I didn't get involved in that personally at all. The technicians are there. They've been there for years. Let them function and let them be able to get it done. I was a little bit aggrieved in terms of data coming forward, in terms of the number of teachers were transferred. There's been a practice over the years that, for instance, teachers go off to teacher training before replacements would have arrived for them. This has been taking place for decades. You know, I've asked the permanent secretary, put provisions in place that when a teacher leaves the classroom, whether it be they are being sent off to training or they're going on to study leave, that the teacher is there to replace them first before we send them off. Other things that we've also done as well. So I think all in all, from a teaching service of about 1,100 to 1,200 teachers, we had a total of about 54 persons who were transferred.
But it would appear, Minister, to be about timing. I mean, the public's perception is that people were transferred or given notice of transfers at the last minute, just before the start of the school year.
Well, I think when you say the public's perception is primarily shaped by 2 or 3 media houses. The fact is the information was false, erroneous, totally wrong.
In other words, are you saying then that these principals were advised? Can you say that they knew about their movements 2 months ahead, or something like that?
Let's start with all the categories. For instance, the transfer of teachers. Every single teacher received some form of notice that they were going to be transferred as early as I think it was June or July. Way in advance. The funny thing, Julian, of the 50...
So those are the teachers?
No, I'm going to start with the teachers, then come to the principals. Okay. The funny thing is, of about the 50-something teachers that we had that were transferred, my understanding is about, from the education officers, about half of those teachers requested to be transferred. Yeah. Now, when it comes to the principals, there were 2 last-minute transfers, and the last-minute transfers came about because the others were notified way in advance. But there were 2 last-minute transfers because there was one individual that we had, that we were waiting for an answer from to be principal. And because of unfortunate circumstances, that person was able to take out. Now, in terms of illness and family situations, then naturally, in any profession, the natural thing is they're going to be emergency situations. So we had, I think it was 2 or 3 last-minute changes to accommodate that situation. But the irony is, Julian, if somebody's going to be transferred, we consult with them. Now, the 2 principals especially that were transferred, they totally agreed. They understood the circumstances, they agreed to it, and I have visited at least 2 in their workplaces, and they're doing an excellent job. I think the principal that received the latest notice for transfer was Sam Roberts, Mr. Sam Roberts, the principal of the Antigua Grammar School. I've since visited Mr. Roberts, and let me tell you, watching Mr. Roberts, talk to me about what's taking place at the school, talking to me about instruction, telling me about some of the challenges that he's had and some of the programs that he think he can implement to be able to structure certain things. And then we spoke at length about a particular student who I understand who is special education, but was able to position himself in the top performers. He's a level 1 student. So that principal, Mr. Roberts at the Antigua Grammar School, to see him at work and then to listen to the media, you realize that there's a total divorce between the reality and the fact.
So you do admit, all right, you clarify then that notice went out in June for most people. Yeah. And then there were last-minute changes.
There were about 3 last-minute changes. So it's not a matter of, I think the thing is...
It's not, in other words, and I come with the public perception or the public information.
You see, and that's why I wanted to correct it.
You were talking about the media, but I think this is an opportunity to clarify, which is, this is the impression people have. Yeah. Minister Brown is out there with a big stick saying, look, I want to move these teachers out, and I don't give a damn about notice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Move him to wherever school, you move him, da-da-da-da-da-da.
But Julian,
if I were a cartoonist, I could do better.
I think the reality is, Julian, I couldn't imagine any minister, much less the Minister of Education. You're talking about teaching staff of you're talking altogether about 1,500 employees in the Ministry of Education, Science and Technology for me to get individually involved. Like I said, my directive was I want the most qualified teachers in areas with students that need them the most. Whatever you have to do to get it done, get it done. Of course, there would have been other concerns. One of we teachers who have been in one school for more than 10 years, give them a new lease. Put them in a new environment. Give them a little bit of change. there were several schools which I went and I had concerns about the administration of the school. And so for me, and this is not just as Minister Brown, but I'm an educator. So if I go into a school, and this would have been getting parent feedback, feedback from parents, getting feedback from the community. You know, you go to the supermarket to pick up groceries and mom comes up to you. This is not taking place at this school. This is taking place at this school. So we're a small country. Everybody talks. And so there were about 2 or 3 schools that I have serious concerns about. And I said, listen, let's fix this. And I'll give you an example of one of the concerns. It does no educational good to start a school year with a principal that is going to retire 2 months into the term. It makes more sense administratively and from a leadership perspective to start the term with a brand new principal. Because what happens when you change leadership in a school in the middle of the year, it places a lot of pressure on the new principal coming in to create that culture. Yeah. And exits are not always orchestrated as nicely as they ought to be. It makes more sense that if you have a leader that's going to take over in that school, that they're the assistant principal right away. But if that chain of command was not grafted before, and you try to do it in the middle of the year, whether it's journalism, whether it's the army, whether it's the police, you create a confusion. It makes sense to make the changes now, reposition those persons to areas where their skills can be best utilized for the good of the overall system. Bring in the new leaders at the start of the school year so they can come in with the students and they can build that culture, build that vibe, cultivate an education environment that is conducive to learning. So Minister Brown getting involved in, you know, like a fiddle, no, it's fiction, yeah. Not true at all.
And related to that, then I have to ask you. I mean, I'm listening to you here, and I get a sense of a hands-on. But at the same time, might you not run the risk, as you, on the one hand, admit to some problems or some failures on your part, as the case may be, to put your technical people now in the spotlight as they're the ones who made the mistakes and not the minister.
Well, when you say mistakes, you realize I have not said mistakes at all.
Yes.
No. When it comes to the transfer, I would say there has been a decades-old practice of, for instance, transferring teachers to teacher training without putting in a replacement. That has been the culture from ever since I was a teacher in the 1990s. Those things I've asked a permanent secretary, put provisions in place so that if we're going to move teachers, we can have their replacement right away. So I have not said mistakes. Like I said, because our PR is not as it should be. I can admit that we have a mistake in that our PR is not as strong. But in terms of being able to move teachers here in Rwanda, did it really create that ruckus in the schools? No, the fact is, every single year you have quite a number of teachers that made their exit out of the system. You have quite a number of teachers that resign. I mean, look at it this way, Julian, you're in media. If someone comes to you, you have a media house, and someone comes to you and says, you know, I have a PhD in nuclear science. I'm a nuclear physicist. And I want you to hire me because I want to be a good journalist. No, you need the person at that particular moment, but you hire them. But in reality, as a manager, you know in 2 or 3 years they're going to be gone because that's not where their true interest lies. In education, like any other profession, we suffer from that. There are instances where teaching is seen as a shortfall. I'm unemployed. The fastest thing for me to do is to get a teaching job. But then in 2 to 3 years' time, that person gets the job that they really want, and they're gone. So this year, for instance, from one high school, we had about 7 teachers that resigned, left the teaching service because they got the job that they really wanted. Now, we have to move teachers around in order to fill those gaps. We also have, all in all, I think about 8 or 9 teachers that went on maternity leave. We have to fill those gaps. We had one teacher that moved from Barbuda to Antigua. We're still trying to fill the gap because there's several things we have to deal with. One, you have to find somebody who's qualified. You have to find somebody who's qualified either in Barbuda already or who's willing to move to Barbuda to take up employment as a teacher. It sounds easier said than done, except that we have not had any resumes of persons wanting to move to Barbuda to teach, or from persons in Barbuda already qualified and want to take up a teaching position. It's just not the case.
So you have to offer a hardship allowance to go to Barbuda?
Well, I mean, there's accommodation for an allowance, but to literally, Julian, to get somebody to say, you know, I'm going to move to Barbuda, I'm going to take up a teaching position. You and I both know, whether in journalism, police, any other profession, to relocate to a different, it's not that easy. It's not as easy as it's been canvassed to be able to do. We have been doing our best to be able to realign teachers and administrators in areas where they're most needed. But in all of that, Julian, you have to remember the ministry took on quite a bit of backlash for some of the policies that we implemented last year when we came into office. When you look at the overall CSEC results and the primary school results, I am not dissuaded that the policies are going anti to the productivity in education, but I am persuaded that somehow the policies are translating into performance. When you look at a country that has gone from an average of between a 31 to a 34, 35% pass mark in mathematics, over you're talking about a 15-year period, and now we're in 54% in mathematics. Something took place that was good. You know, between the teachers, between the principals, between greater connections with the students, greater connections with the parents, something happened that was positive.
You're watching On Point with Julian Rogers, still to come.
At the youth rally, we expect that we'll hear all the top students in every category, etc., in the Island Scholarship be announced.
Yes.
This year, no. What happened?
Well, there was quite a quandary that created with the Island Scholarship.
You're watching On Point with Julian Rogers.
The primary schools.
Yes.
You talk about some schools in the country that have a small number of students, and then everybody wants to be in the city, as the case may be. Again and again we hear that students arrive at a secondary school without having really had a good foundation. What is required? What can you do? What have you set up to do to address this?
Well, one of our first things, Julian, is if you talk to, and as an educator first, we have to stop playing the blame game. The high schools are going to say the students arrived ill-equipped to perform. The primary schools are going to say, well, you know, they came to us from the communities, from parents, they were ill-equipped to perform and we were unable to help them. So we stop the blame game and we start by looking at ourselves. How do we respond to our students? One way is to change the conversation that we have about our students. Starts with positive conversation. I'll give you something that really irritated the epidermis off of me, Julian. When I spoke to one principal and I said to the principal, you have about 14 students that are going to take the primary school exam. My expectation is at least 2 of those students will be able to get in the top 100. And that was in September last year. Now, the principal started the conversation by telling me that that principal wasn't convinced that the students were going to make it. Now, when you have an entire year to prepare, and you start by telling me that the students are not going to make it, forget me being a minister. As an educator, it tells me that you have mentally created a condition of failure. There was another principal we visited and we had a conversation with, and that principal sent in 7 students to do the primary school exams. Now I have a photographic memory for data, so I asked the principal, well, tell me about your students' performance. And the principal said, well, you know, they came, their backgrounds and their families and the economic situations, recipe for failure. Now let's use the reverse. I had a conversation with another principal and I said, well, tell me about your performance. And the principal said, well, our numeracy was this. This is the problem that we suffered from in numeracy. And in terms of literacy, these are areas in which we can build on. Now that principal was in a much smaller school. And I said, you know what, perhaps we might need that teacher, that principal, in an area where the skills can best be utilized. There's another principal that I also visited, and when we started the conversation, we started by that principal telling me, this is how I start my school year. I look at the performance of my students coming in from the primary school exams. We assess to see how best we can meet the students based on their levels, and then we move and we guide them throughout the year with instruction. So the conversation you spoke about, we look at various areas of teaching and we find what's the best way that we can meet our students and we can take them to that additional level. So that's what we're having throughout the system overall.
So primary school, leading to secondary school, we're attempting to ensure that everybody gets a place.
Yeah.
No more the pain of the 11 plus.
Yes, yes.
Am I
But you
correct
see,
here?
yes, but you see, with that as well, Julian, as a region, and you can't really say just in Antigua, as a region, our key focus is that when it comes to primary school, we focus, we tend to push teachers that we find, like for instance, when you go through a list of applications, the tendency has been region-wide, that it's primary school, you can take a chance, put them in there, they will grow. The fact is, we need our most qualified and most experienced teachers in primary school, because that's where students, once they get it there, they're going to get it. If you miss them in primary school by third form, you would have lost them altogether. And by fifth form, they're already gone. So the aim is, and that's why I spoke earlier about we're upgrading the entire teaching service. But the key focus first in tiers, we start with our principals and our deputy principals, and we're moving towards, hopefully by January, we'll have additional deputy principals, a deputy principal for every 250 students in our schools to strengthen the administrative leadership at the schools. Now that complements the already layers there that was created before, from the level heads to the various subject heads. How best do we strengthen capacity in the school? So we start with the upgrading of all our principals, all our deputy principals. We look forward towards upgrading primarily our primary school teachers first. And so I've asked all the EOs, the education officers, especially in the primary schools, look in your zone. Look at areas, and when you get because there are going to be an onslaught of applications, you determine which teachers you want to upgrade first based on the need in your area. So when we upgrade and strengthen the capacity of starting with our principals and our primary school teachers, it means we're building the foundation as we come along. Now, it doesn't mean, Julian, that we're going to do it overnight. Education is not something like construction. Construction, you can come and say, we're going to pour this and you see the immediate results tomorrow. In order for you to see the results and the benefits of education, you have to look over a prolonged period of time, the accumulation of data, and you will be able to see the results as early as 3, maybe even 4 years. The fact is, when you look at the increased academic performance in especially public schools, in the last 2 years, we have projected a growth of continuous jump. For the first time in about, in all, about 11 to 12 years. We have had the highest percentage performance in public schools, with students passing 5 subjects, a minimum of 5 subjects, including math and English, for the first time in about 11 or 12 years.
Which brings me to the question of the Island scholarships.
Yeah.
At the youth rally, we expect that we'll hear all the top students in every category, etc., in the Island scholarship be announced.
Yes.
This year, no. What happened?
Well, there was quite a quandary that created with the Island scholarship, with the Island scholars, or the 2 potential Island scholars for this year. As you know, the recommendation is made to the minister for ratification. But there was a matter that took place in terms of a paper that was to be remarked, the clarity of the policy, and there were many things which I, in particular, was as uncertain about, especially after some interested parties wrote to me expressing certain concerns about some anomalies which were occurring. Being an elected representative, I didn't think it prudent for me to get personally involved. What I asked the permanent secretary to do instead is to put together a committee, and that committee have them look into, do an investigation, and investigate and find out, did we do something wrong? Did something occur which ought not to have been occurred? Was there some sort of inappropriate action which occurred, not on the part of the students, but in terms of, was there a breakdown in the system that created had there been an announcement, there would have been quite a bit of unease, and there would have been a legal battle which would have incurred.
Realistically, what could go wrong if we are just dealing with the question of passes?
Well, I think if we were just dealing with an issue of passes, Julian, it would have been just easy to say, well, this student got more than this, and but it's when
so what are the other qualifiers?
When you look at, for instance, the policy that was presented to me, and and something that I have a problem with, Julian, and I'm sure that you will empathize. When a technician comes to me and says, well, Minister, this is the policy, I'm going to ask, well, where is it written? That is the policy. Well, we've just been doing it over the years. I'm like, but if you're asking me to ratify something, you have to give me and show me that this has been the history of how things have been done. If that does not occur, then it creates a confusion in me, because then as the minister, if you're asking me to ratify something and you have not provided clarity, then you're setting me up for failure. I must satisfy myself that the persons or person who are chosen are the persons who ought to be there. If I am not satisfied, then what relies is that I go back to the permanent secretary and say, there's something here that just doesn't feel right, doesn't seem right. And obviously, Julian, because it's an ongoing investigation, it would be premature of me to disclose certain things because the investigation continues. It should conclude.
But you can at this stage say there's no written down policy on how this matter is handled.
There's a policy. What do you mean, the investigation or
the written down policy on how the island scholarship is awarded?
There's a verbal policy, but there's no written policy.
So this
that
is
has
convention
been presented.
More than anything else.
Yes, it seems like it. Yeah, but there's some parts of it that I don't understand. Like for instance, I know for instance there's a point system that's awarded based on the grade, and I wouldn't even attempt to explain it to you or the public because, like I said, I myself don't understand it. And so what I've asked the permanent secretary to do, from wheresoever you need to draw persons from. I think there's one representative from the legal department, the next one from the Ministry of Finance. Look into it and find out, did we make a mistake? Did we mess up? For instance, I'll give you an example. There was a challenge or query, for instance, about the suggestion of cheating, communication with CXC. Not for the students, but these are matters that, in my estimation, ought to have been addressed. And I don't feel comfortable ratifying something until I would have satisfied myself that, this is fair and this is how it ought to have been. There were some suggestions tossed out that we announced 2 island scholars, but it comes with financial implications. And to be fair to all the potential candidates who could be island scholars, we want to make sure that when we make that selection, whether it's 1 person or whether it's 2 persons, that it's fair and it fits within the tradition of the island scholar as it rightfully ought to be. But until I am satisfied based on the investigation report. Now, when the report comes out in another 2 weeks and the recommendation is, Minister, we go this way or we go that way, then they would have done their investigation as thorough. And I will be guided based on the report, which persons who are so qualified to do, rather than a minister ratify the decision and not being fully informed of what's taking place. We spoke about consultation earlier. This investigation is a form of consultation to make sure that we get it right. It's not about making sure that we get out the information. We want to get out the information as expeditiously as possible. But we also want to make sure that when the information comes out, it is correct. We don't want no controversy to follow afterwards.
You're watching On Point with Julian Rogers, still to come.
You got scholarships through the government awards. You got scholarships that you get from several other countries around the world, as the case may be. How are you managing this program to ensure that the areas of study match the needs of this country?
Well, I think there's several.
You're watching On Point with Julian Rogers.
Let's stay with scholarships, not the island scholarship now, but the overall scholarship program.
Which one? There's
overall.
Several.
And as I'm saying, now, I'm asking you, you got scholarships through the government awards. You got scholarships that you get from several other countries around the world, as the case may be. How are you managing this program to ensure that the areas of study match the needs of this country?
Well, I think there's several. Well, first of all, I'll start with the Board of Education Scholarship. Yes. The Board of Education Scholarship is the sole scholarship entity through which the minister overseas its efficient running. Scholarships that comes from overseas countries, Julian, except for the OAS, the Sheving, the Fulbright Scholarship, Commonwealth Scholarship, those primarily do not come to the Ministry of Education.
But from the Prime Minister's office.
From the Prime Minister's office, and that
you have no say in that.
Yeah,
at
no,
all?
that has nothing to do with the Ministry of Education. That is the Prime Minister's scholarship managed by a scholarship committee, and that's why I say the domain of scholarships under the Ministry of Education through the Board of Education scholarships.
There's something not wrong with that, in that you have no say in those scholarships from the point of view of assessing the potential for contributing to the educational development of this country?
Julian, you're asking me to make a judgment call, which I won't. What I will do,
Why not?
I will
You're
talk.
the Minister of Education.
But that's why I start by saying, Julian, let's talk about the Board of Education scholarships, and I can show you how they're realigned and restructured.
But that I remember the public would say, but how come the Minister of Education doesn't have a say in the scholarship program or that is in the Prime Minister's office? In other words, this is an award, yes, but understanding the placement of these scholarships and how they compare or complement the scholarships provided by the Board of Education.
Well, I mean, it all depends on.
In other words, if your ministry decided that in terms of human workforce development in this country, we needed 29 dentists, but the Board of Education can only award 5, and there are 99 in the Prime Minister's program.
Yes, go ahead.
Would you not be in a position, or the public would expect that you would react in some way?
Well, look at it. Let's look at it overall. Yeah? One, the structure is not unfamiliar. In the most developed countries, from Canada to the UK to the United States, various entities offering scholarship is not unfamiliar. Even in Barbados and Trinidad, you have different entities. Let's give you an example. For instance, there are scholarships that are offered through the Ministry of Environment. There are training and scholarships that are offered to the training division. And that's why I said if we start with the focus, for instance, on the Board of Education, how we have restructured, not if we have restructured, how we have restructured the Board of Education scholarship, which is primarily the chief scholarship issuing entity in the country. What we have done, OAS scholarships, the Organization of American States Scholarships, and the Fulbright scholarships primarily focus on the STEM areas: science, technology, education, mathematics, and generally healthcare and those areas. We have restructured the Board of Education scholarships so the priority areas go towards STEM subjects. One of the key areas, the key things as well, is to move away that provision where you can pick up the phone as an individual person, call the Minister of Education and say, I want a scholarship, and get it. Because I'm an elected official. If you vote for me, or if you tell me you vote for me and you say you need a scholarship, I can't tell you no, whether or not your child is qualified. But if you it makes it difficult for me to say no. But if you put a board in place and you start early and you said, these are the qualifications, these are the priority areas. So the priority areas for us: science, technology, education or education-related field, anything with mathematics or mathematics-related field, and healthcare, security, and that type of stuff. Then once you apply to the Board of Education, you know what the maximum is going to be. They ask you to meet certain requirements, minimum requirements of financial ability and so on. Once you're able to satisfy those elements of the Board of Education scholarship, it means that once you satisfy that requirement, more than likely you will get a scholarship. There are other areas. You have the Prime Minister's Scholarship, as I mentioned, that is managed by the Scholarship Committee, the National Scholarship Committee, located in the Prime Minister's office. Through the Division of Training, you have quite a number of scholarships and short-term scholarship training that's available through the Division of Training. You have, for instance, through Environment, you have various scholarships that are being offered. As a ministry, we try to consolidate, we try to have a greater dialogue with the areas and let them know that as a nation, and that's what Cabinet is for. So once we would have articulated and said, these are the areas where we need to focus on, not just the Ministry of Education deciding, but that's where it comes to the Cabinet level. and cabinet makes an overall decision, this is where we're going, then my responsibility as the minister in charge of the Board of Education Scholarship is to make sure we move in that direction.
So it's not fair. So you're not being fair to yourself in this context if you say then that you don't have a say in the Prime Minister's scholarships. In other words, you are aware of what the scholarship program is.
Well, look at it this way. My tendency is whether it's the environment, the Prime Minister's scholarship, whether it's to the training division, the volume of work in terms of reform and so on that's already in front of me is tantamount, Julian. It would be a bit premature for me to step in and have conversations in the functioning of other areas until I am satisfied that we're able to get
all
it
I'm
right.
All I'm asking is,
I know what you're asking,
is whether in the context of human resource development in this country, with your portfolio for education, where all training, all scholarship programs in this regard, is that it is fed into one central position so that you know in your overall planning for future scholarship development that these are the priority needs and this area is providing that and this area is providing that.
And Julian, and I know that sounds like a very simple question, but it has a very, it doesn't.
But this is one government.
I know, but it doesn't, it's a simple question, but it doesn't have a,
it's not a simple question.
It's a straightforward question, but it doesn't have a straightforward answer.
Yeah.
The reason being, Julian, and like I said, when you look at, for instance, of larger Commonwealth countries or even smaller Commonwealth countries or equivalent size, nowhere in the world is it done where there's one entity that just
I'm not suggesting that there's one entity. I'm only suggesting that you as the education ministry is fully aware of exactly the load of scholarship opportunities and placement so that there's no duplication of effort. That is in essence what I'm talking about here.
Well, when you say duplication of effort, it's talking about duplication of scholarships or... No, let me tell you why it doesn't rise to that level of alarm for me, Julian. When you look at, we're guided by the orientation from OAS, Fulbright, Sheeving, and I forgot the other one. When we decide, listen, these are the areas in which, as a nation, we need the greatest strengths.
All right, so that's the education ministry speaking.
No. As I said, when I say we are guided as a nation. Yeah? And when I say we are guided as a nation, it's not just a nation. This is a regional study that was done. And the reason why we have, for OAS, the Organization of American States, and Fulbright, primarily those areas. Because as a region, as a country, as a nation, those are the areas where we have the most severe shortage.
Do you know why I'm persisting with this?
I'm not sure. But
because so often people go off to study and they come back expecting jobs. And these are not necessarily people who have gone on your program, for instance, of the Board of Education program. So I'm saying that as a country, you're saying as a country that we need to make these decisions. Therefore, I'm asking you as the education minister and the ministry whether you are keeping sufficient tabs on what is happening in the award of scholarships under all these other programs so that we don't end up in a situation where people come back from Morocco having studied architecture and there are architecture jobs for them.
Well, you see, one of the, I disagree with your phraseology in terms of persons going to get an education and not coming back and getting jobs.
No, coming back and not getting
and not getting jobs.
Yeah.
I think the benefits of a university degree, Julian, is not that when you return, a job would automatically be provided for you.
But that's not the point I'm pushing here. You know?
I know, but I want to challenge that assumption because what it does, it leads me in a direction that I ought not, that I don't feel comfortable going. And that's why I say I correct it. Now, when you come back from university, your aim is not that you come and like, I'm qualified, I need a job, but your aim is to be able, you're in a position to be able to find employment for yourself. Now, when we look at what you have said overall, I'm going to come back to your initial point. When you look at what was said overall, is the ministry in a position to be able to advise us to the direction to where our national needs? The ministry doesn't do it by itself. And the reason why the ministry does not and cannot do it by itself, our constitution is not so structured. The ministry works in collaboration, and this is done through the overall issue of cabinet. The ministry does it in collaboration with the Ministry of Finance, with the Prime Minister's Office, with the Division of Training, with various sectors at how it's done. Let's look at even the University of the West Indies, Julian. When you look at the University of West Indies, or region's oldest tertiary, the bastion of education in the Caribbean. For the hospital in Jamaica, the Mona campus, it's not the Ministry of Education that gives the final say. It is the Ministry of Health. Whereas when it comes to various other things, you have different ministries who step in. So our developmental path going forward is not that the Ministry of Education, for instance, when our university comes on stream, we work collaboratively with the Ministry of Health to determine what the requirements are for the school, for the school of
why
nurses.
is it so hard to admit?
Yeah, you say admit as if, no, Julian.
Why it is so hard to admit the requirement for clear consultation as far as the awarding of scholarships is concerned?
Well, Julian, when you say admit, you assume that there's something to hide.
No, I'm not suggesting a hiding.
So that's
I'm just saying that the question put simply is this. Minister Brown, are you aware of the scholarship awards of the Prime Minister's Office, the number of scholarships awarded by any other entity outside of the Board of Education, and do you use the information gathered from those sources to determine the award of scholarships under the Board of Education program?
Oh, yes.
Can I put it any better than that?
Yes, of course. Yes, we do. No, the information we receive.
We spent 5 minutes trying to get to that point.
But Julian, you have to remember that when you asked that question just now, the clarity with which you asked that question. Previously, when you asked the other three questions, those were leading questions.
Leading questions.
Leading questions.
I never provide leading questions.
Julian, look at this.
I try to be as clear as possible.
Look at it this way.
All I'm saying is a consultation and awareness.
The last question that you answer is a yes or no question. Yes, we are aware of it. And yes, we use that to inform and to drive. But it's not just on a national level. It's on a regional level. And a lot of information as it's fed to us, and we act accordingly. And that's why we have shaped that policy towards primarily STEM areas, and then healthcare and national security.
Minister, thank you very much. And so that's this week's edition of On Point. We'll have a further conversation with Minister Michael Brown, responsible for education, science, and technology. On Point. I'm Julian Rogers.